Before we begin, can I ask one small favor? If you like the show and the conversations we're sharing, it would mean the world to me if you could subscribe to the show and follow along on whatever platform you're listening to this on. You may not know it, but by simply subscribing, you are helping us in a big way to continue creating and sharing our quiet conversations. Thank you so much. Now, onwards to the show.
Forget about being mentally distressed, but actually we can be happy even when we're depressed. Everybody has mental health, but not everybody has good mental health. I think the danger is if you focus on the simple things which are supportive, which one would do anyway and should do anyway. You neglect or normalize more serious pathologies or issues with the mind, because there is also poor mental health to a point where people have mental illness and mental disorders. I really am a big believer in this principle of unity with diversity. To be equal, you don't have to be the same. Out of 8 billion people, 7 billion people identify with having a religion, a faith. And of the 1 billion who don't, 50% of them identify themselves as spiritual. I know if they had cancer, they wouldn't pray the cancer away. They would go and get radiotherapy, chemotherapy, surgery, whatever they need to get. But because the mind sits so close to the soul, people often get the two mixed up. I'm Dr. Chetna Kang. I'm a consultant psychiatrist and a teacher of Bhakti Yoga.
This week on The Quiet Life, we're talking about the relationship between mental health and spirituality, and how we reconcile the relationship between the two, one being evidence-based and one being wisdom-based. And so I'm speaking to Dr. Chetna Kang, a consultant psychiatrist, broadcaster, and Bhakti Yoga Teacher. She's well known for her spiritual commentary on mental health and current affairs, and presents the Thought of the Day for Radio 4's Today program, and features on Beyond Belief and World of Wisdom on BBC, which reaches an audience in the hundreds of millions around the world. Graduating from Imperial College as a medical doctor and then specializing in psychiatry, she brings together over 2 decades of experience in scientific advances in mental health with integrative models of care. Dr. Kang is on the executive committee for the Royal College of Psychiatrists Spirituality and Psychiatry SIG, and was a finalist for the Royal College's Public Educator of the Year award for 2 consecutive years. I hope you find value in this conversation. I'm excited to share it with you. Now, onwards to the show. How did we get to mental health as just a walk in the park?
Good question. I ask myself that too. Generally, I find when people talk about mental health, they're well-meaning. We've wanted to, especially over the last 5 years, I've seen a big trend to open up this conversation around mental health, to destigmatize it, make it easier for people to not just talk about it, but get help. But what we've got to remember is mental health is a spectrum. Everybody has mental health, but not everybody has good mental health. And in trying to promote people having better mental health, I think people have focused a lot on the preventative side. For example, going for a walk in the park, sleeping more, eating regularly, simple things that are going to help anyone who has a mind, which is everybody, right? But I think the danger is if you focus on the simple things which are supportive, which one would do anyway and should do anyway, you can quite often neglect, and I see this, you neglect or normalize more serious pathologies or issues with the mind, because there is also poor mental health to a point where people have mental illness and mental disorders, and they shouldn't be made to feel that something like a walk in the park is enough to cure a depression or a schizophrenia, because it puts then a different type of stigma, a different type of pressure on them, in that if you're suffering with a severe mental illness, to then be made to feel like, okay, I should be able to fix myself with a walk in the park. Why am I not like everybody else? Because that's that's the majority of what social media is dealing with. So I think it's twofold. How did it get reduced to a walk in the park? Is because we've opened up the conversation to anyone and everyone. At the same time, I would say that's not all it is.
Chetna, thank you so much for joining the show. I'm really looking forward to our conversation, because you have a very interesting background, right? From your work in psychiatry and medical doctor, as well as your work in the spiritual space. How does that work? How did you come to this place of 2 seemingly different things in the same conversation?
I was at medical school. I was probably towards the end of my first year, right? And around that same time, I started looking more deeply into, I guess, the Vedic or Eastern philosophies. And, in our first year and second year, we're very much based on studying the anatomy. We're dissecting cadavers and studying embryology and literally looking at the development of a fetus right in front of us through live models from 8 weeks old right through till birth. And I'd always had an interest in spirituality and who we are beyond the body and the mind. And often, I think, a similar experience to a lot of people brought up in a religious family. You don't always get answers, but you have a culture you follow and festivals you follow. But when I got to university, I came across books and friends who were reading these books, these Vedic texts like the Bhagavatam and Bhagavad Gita. And what I found really fascinating was, this whole thing of science and spirituality being in competition that's often propagated, and especially in the 90s when I was young, it was very much propagated that science and spirituality kind of opposing forces. It started to become apparent to me that actually they work in synergy. One's looking at the how did this happen and the other is why, right? Like science deals with the nitty-gritty, the matter side of things, right? That you can deal with logic and perspective. And then you've got spirituality, but why? What's the purpose? What's the end goal? Where did this come from? What's the root cause? So I started reading these books, and one of the standout points for me was when I was reading the embryology books, preparing for my embryology exam. Embryology, the development of the fetus. This was a picture book, probably based on research and pictures over just the last few years prior. And we know we hadn't really understood the development of the fetus for more than a few decades prior to that. On the other hand, I had this other book called the Srimad Bhagavatam, and I had the third book in it, and it also had a whole chapter, a very long chapter on the development of the fetus. And then this book's like 5,000 years old. Right? And I thought, hang on a minute, I wonder if they correlate in terms of the development of the fetus. And you know what was fascinating? Not only did they correlate in terms of the externals, the development of the spine, the hearing, the various senses, but the more sacred texts, I guess, the Srimad Bhagavatam, also then started talking about the evolution of consciousness and how that changes from development in the fetus and then once the child's born and into adulthood. And I just thought, wow, these books, which are 5,000 years old, have even scientifically the same knowledge which we as, a modern, forward-thinking society have come to conclusions with in quite a crude way, right? Because I think one thing that was shocking to me and a lot of my peers was when we had our embryology seminars and sessions and we'd be in the labs, I remember when we walked in, I thought they were dolls, and they weren't. So it's quite a crude method to, take the child, and you have to quite literally dissect the child to know what's been going on. So for me, I think at university, as I saw that actually science and spirituality are not opposing, they can be integrated, they can work in synergy, and they actually help us to understand ourselves as a whole. I think I started developing both my scientific knowledge of the body, the mind, etc., alongside the spiritual understanding of the self. When I finished and we had to pick our medical specialties, I loved surgery. I loved, being a physician. I found all of those things really, really interesting. But with psychiatry, I found it gave me permission to integrate the body, mind, and the soul. And so then I just proceeded with, I guess, going deeper in my own spiritual life, my own spiritual commitments, trained and ordained as a priest. And and that evolved into actually integrating the two together, both in terms of my own understanding and my teaching, and also in practice. Because if you look at the Royal College of Psychiatrists, we have a special interest group for spirituality and psychiatry, and we have a 5,000 strong membership.
Wow.
5,000 psychiatrists who also feel like actually this is an important area.
Well, it's a really interesting question, because while you were explaining that, I was wondering how much was that supported in the medical community? Because from an outsider, there's very much this feeling that there's medical science over here and spirituality or conscious beliefs over here. You having this first interest and then exploration into it, was that all your professors and teachers, were they saying, you go for it, get into that, or were they kind of saying, that's wrong?
I think in the 90s, you just didn't talk about spirituality and science in the same space. But I don't think any of my teachers ever knew. It was something, my spirituality was something I cultivated separately. I would say it became more obviously integrated, and there was much more permission to talk about it from, I would say, more the mid to late 2000s. Because even if you look at our spirituality and psychiatry special interest group at the Royal College, it was born in 1999. Right now, okay, that's 25 years ago, and that feels like a long time. But when you've lived and worked through that time, it still feels quite fresh. And so I've seen that evolution that, you know, there was a time when you just couldn't say spirituality and medicine in the same sentence. And now, not only are they in the same sentence, they're integrated. Patients very clearly want to be able to have those conversations with their physicians. And a lot of our colleagues, they also want to understand, how can I facilitate that conversation with my patient, even if I'm not spiritual or religious myself, because actually it helps me to treat them better. And we had a conference on what's God got to do with it? And is there a place for God in psychiatry? Because in all this talk of spirituality, people often don't talk about God. And it was almost like God became a dirty word. You can talk about yourself, you can talk about your soul, you can talk about being spiritual. You might be able to also talk about being religious, but leave God out of it, because that's, you know, that's maybe a bit too much of a stretch. But actually this conference was really successful because it gave people permission to speak about something, someone that they feel very strongly. If you look at global statistics, out of 8 billion people, 7 billion people identify with having a religion, a faith. And of the 1 billion who don't, 50% of them identify themselves as spiritual. So now 7.5 billion people on the planet, and you don't talk about God.
It's a big majority you're missing out.
Yes.
So let's wind it back for a moment. So how do you define spirituality?
Spirituality, in its most universal understanding, I would say, is that sense of self that is separate from our psychological self, our physiological self, and our social self. So who am I when no one's looking? Who am I when I'm not judging? And who's that witness who's watched this body I have, this mentality I have change from, you know, small baby to childhood to adulthood? Because that whole time there's been the me that's watched all of that, and there's been the me that's stayed the same. So that's at the most universal and baseline aspect of spirituality, is really, who am I beyond just this?
And I'd love to actually hear how you answer this question, because I get this question a lot as a meditation teacher is, you know, we often talk about the spirit or the consciousness, and while it is not defined by the physical body or the thoughts, where does that actually sit and reside? Is it a location in the body? Is it a sense of perspective on your personality or being? How would you talk about that as the location of your consciousness or your spirit?
The location of me?
Yeah. Where are you if you are not muscles and bones, thoughts, and what you see?
Yeah. Well, it's not that I'm not these things, but they are part of me rather than who I am, right? So actually there's a really nice text in the Bhagavad Gita which explains it really nicely. That which pervades the entire body with consciousness, know that to be the soul. So actually all of this is me, but this word soul or spirit is the seat of this spirituality, the me, the who I am, not just the what I am.
And is there anything in the medical community that would agree with that or adamantly disagree with that?
There are going to be very polarized views, right? There are going to be some people like, well, if you can't prove to me that I'm a soul, then I'm not a soul. I'm just, you know, the mechanics, the machinery, the thoughts, the feelings. And as long as I'm a good person, I'm happy with that. But of course, they're entitled to that. Why not? You know, live and let live. And then there's the other side of like, okay, well, yes, I understand. I'm on board with this. There is a witness consciousness. There is definitely the me that's watched all of these changes. And if through all of these changes, the me has remained the same, then there's something, some part of me that outlives and is independent of what goes on with just the brain and the body and the thoughts and the feelings, because we can observe our thoughts, we can observe our feelings. Now, someone might go, well, that could just be another part of your brain. I'm like, okay, well, just as much as you might say to a priest, prove the soul, I could say, well, then prove that part of the brain. The point I'm trying to make is spirituality really at the beginning point is about understanding that there's more to us than meets the eye. How you try to prove that is a different question entirely.
I think as human beings, we're always looking for something to not work, right? We're always skeptical about prove to me that this is. And I think the reality is we have to go with what our experiences are. We have to lend our beliefs somewhere. Otherwise, we're almost inadvertently saying we are the highest form of our thoughts or our consciousness. But when you talk about, earlier you were talking about religion and spirituality, are they mutually exclusive? How do you walk the line between? And where is it that people can find their way with either or both?
I would say religion's a vehicle for spirituality. They should be very much synonymous. Religion traditionally especially was seen to be where the seat of people finding their spiritual experiences, their spiritual framework. It gives you a community and it gives you a framework. Vehicles have to be in good shape for you to drive them. They've got to be genuine vehicles, not just a mock vehicle. They've got to be clear about their destination. So even if you have a religion or a vehicle which is genuine, we also have to follow it genuinely. It's not just simply, I've got a Ferrari, but I never drive it. So a lot of people will say they're religious, but they don't engage with it in any way other than just maybe the cultural norms, or to even covet it perhaps as another way to strengthen, I guess, this transient ego and our place in this world. And they separate the actual spirituality, the evolution of consciousness.
So can there be unity between science and spirituality when science itself has limitations in its measurement tools?
It's like asking, can you measure a mountain with a ruler? You could, but it'd take a really long time. It's hard to measure something or understand something that's bigger than the mind with the mind, right? We're using the mind. Particle physics is based on our constructs, our own intellectual constructs. But we're trying to measure something. Even if you look at the universe, forget spirituality. It's way bigger than anyone's brain and intellect, right? So forget the particles and wave challenge. Because, if I look at that, for me, that's just a case of energy and then the manifestation of energy. They're actually the same thing. You're just looking at it from different angles. So I actually think I really am a big believer in this principle of unity with diversity. To be equal, you don't have to be the same. And I think there needs to be parity between the value that spirituality brings, those things which are not obvious to the five working senses, as well as the strength and value we give to science, which is really about how does this work. And I think we'd be just a lot happier and cooperative as a planet and as a race if, rather than going, I'll keep to mine and you keep to yours, so how can we actually collaborate and work synergistically? And the bits that maybe don't make sense through this lens, maybe I can look at it through a different lens.
And so when we talk about spirituality, then, if we go into that specifically, and more these days, and I'd probably say in the recent world of wellness or well-being, I'd probably go as far as to say we've come to the point where we understand having a conscious belief in spirituality or aspects of a practice that help us and support us are good for us, good for our mental health. But I also don't think there's enough clarity or accuracy on how we actually use it. So my question for you is, how is it good for your mental health?
That's a really good question, because I think the question of is it good for you has already been answered, right? People know that, if I cultivate a sense of self which is separate from just what the world sees, it's going to give me some resilience. If I am looking beyond my immediate problems, that's going to bring a certain level of resilience. But it's not just that. The idea of how do the spiritual practices, how do those mindsets, how does the culture, how does evolving and nourishing that side of ourselves actually have a direct impact on the mind, on the brain, has actually been of interest and been researched since at least the 1960s and 70s.
Really?
Yes. If you look at in the 60s and 70s, we saw a big upsurge in an uptake of an interest, right? A real interest in particularly the Eastern philosophies, right? Buddhism, the Vedic texts, etc. People wanting to know more about, I believe in God, I believe in a soul, but I want to find out a little bit more beyond just the framework of religion. Maybe there's some other way to look at it. And so meditation became popular, right? Mantra became popular. Even different ways of dressing became popular, right? You think about the 60s and 70s and the tie-dye and the loose flowing clothing and incense, for example, right? So the fragrances, everything changed, food changed. And so since the 60s, 70s, we've seen actually medical, tons of when I say tons, literally a study after study looking into the effects of meditation and mantra and spiritual practices and prayer and so many different things, a relationship with God, sacred architecture, all of these things. What is the impact these have on your physiology? What's the impact this has on your neural networks? The impact this has on the way you feel about yourself in the world. So when you look at these studies, not just as standalone individual satellite studies, but actually do a meta-analysis, look at them as a whole. What are they telling you? Now, what we've identified through decades of research is that there's 5 pillars of spirituality that are good for your mental health. And the 5 broad categories, and you can go as detailed as you want into each of them. So first of all, the most obvious one, okay, what we do, so the spiritual practices. Mm-hmm. Okay, I think, to be honest, the evidence of meditation and prayer, yoga, whichever tradition you're from, okay, whether it's dharmic faiths, Abrahamic faiths, or of no faith at all, when you're engaging in practices or like prayer, meditation, etc., utterances of mantras, there is definitely a physiological shift in your blood pressure, in your pulse rate. There's an improvement in cognitive function. We see that there is a reduction in the fear centers of the brain, okay, and we see an expansion and growth in the parts of the brain that are to do with safety and feeling content. That particular pillar is very strong. It's very much talked about. People understand it.
And would you limit that to meditation, mantras, chanting, yoga, or could that expand outside of specific traditional practices? Or is the only context for that value within traditional lineage-based practices?
And the things that have been researched have been traditional lineage-based practices, because if you look at a lot of the mantras and meditations and prayers, people rarely just make one up, right? People generally don't make up a mantra. I mean, we have our positive...
You're surprised.
Yeah, really?
I mean, these days with anything, I mean, as popularity with practices grow in any Western context, there's always going to be ways in which people can utilize them for value outside of its core value.
No, sure, but that's the purpose, not the actual activity. So, for example, like you take something like yoga, right? There's a difference between the yoga that's taught in an ashram in the Himalayas in India versus the yoga that you get in your gym down the road.
Yeah.
Okay? And that's not just in terms of one is secularized, the other one isn't. But that's also in terms of the level of expertise you're getting in terms of, and also the purpose. You know, in an ashram, you're probably aligning it with some spiritual development. In the gym, you're more likely to, I'm not saying you're only going to, but you're more likely to align it to your physical health and perhaps also your mental health, right? So the purpose aside, I think inherently the things that have been researched have been lineage-based, because generally people don't tend to make up a prayer randomly, unless, of course, there's that whole prayer element where it's my own words. But like mantras also, regardless of the purpose someone uses a mantra for, they will generally tend to go for a mantra which is already rooted in a lineage, even if they separate themselves from the lineage. Totally. So the research is generally based on something which is rooted.
Yeah, and I totally agree with that wholeheartedly, because obviously in a lot of the work that we do within our organization, Just Breathe, we use, even though there's an agnostic approach to the work, so it's accessible, so it's relatable, all the mantras that I teach with and share with are lineage-based traditional ones, except if it's not on purpose for a very specific reason.
Sure.
Because of that understanding that it's passed down with the wisdom that comes with it, that we don't necessarily need science to prove, but at the same time, it's great to know there is science to prove it now for the skeptical mind.
I mean, what is wisdom? Wisdom is a type of research. It's a type of science, isn't it? Something that's passed down, it's worked. Otherwise, they would have stopped doing it, right?
It's a beautiful thing. I mean, and so go further into that. So when we look at spiritual practices, so you said the first one was practices, whether it's mantras, yoga, meditation. What else is on the list?
So the second pillar, and these aren't in any order. Mm-hmm. I'm doing them in the order that I'm remembering. Okay, so the second pillar is really the positive psychology. Now, I'm not talking about the positive psychology that's there in pop psychology. Some of it may appear in pop psychology, but the positive psychological attributes, I would say they're spiritually positive psychology, right? So things like forgiveness and gratitude, kindness, tolerance, patients. Now, as I'm listing those off, probably people listening are going, well, hang on, why is that spiritual? But if you look traditionally, the roots of, particularly look at something like forgiveness and gratitude, the roots of those attitudes and understanding them and incorporating them into your life are generally found in spiritual texts. That you get a whole, you look at Buddhism, you look at Vedic texts, you look at Christian texts, whether Dharmic or Abrahamic, there's some really holistic approach around how that practicing forgiveness or practicing gratitude has an impact on body, mind, and soul. While science might be busy researching how forgiveness is good for your brain and your body, it's not going to do any research on really how it helps you develop spiritually. So actually the research shows that actually when you're practicing spirituality, you're more likely to embrace these positive psychological attributes. And these are also, again, they're really good for your mental health.
So in those things, how do you practice them? Is that just more keeping them front of mind as you walk around every day?
How do you practice them? I'm going to say just pause that thought till we get to the fifth pillar. Because what you'll find is when you see the 5 pillars, just the way pillars are the cornerstones of a building, you'll see that actually the 5 really match and they correlate and they work together. Okay? So we have our practices, we have our positive psychology. Okay? So then the third thing is a like-minded spiritual community. So a network of people who have similar ideas or are maybe some are further along with developing those ideas, and not just those ideas, but they apply those ideas and they see the results of those ideas. They see the results of the hypothesis, like we say in the scientific world. As you said before, we have to invest our faith somewhere. Where our nature is to first believe and then get the proof. That is just, we do that even in science. A hypothesis is really a faith-based statement. Then you carry out a method, and then you come to a conclusion. Spirituality is no different. There's a science behind spirituality. It's not blind doubt nor blind faith. It shouldn't be there. So we look at this. So you look at people who are part of a like-minded spiritual community where the application of the positive psychology and the practices is not just available, but there are people who are ahead of you. There are people that you can care for. And just that in itself is also, again, good for your mental health. The thing is, now, you could look at all of these and say, well, we can just secularize that if we're just talking about mental health. But the mind is not a standalone aspect of ourselves, and it's not just all we are. And I want to come back to that way more than the mind. But so third pillar is that spiritual community.
Sorry, just before you go on to the fourth one, when you talked about secularizing that, because also there's obviously a lot of people listening who are going to say, okay, well, going to an ashram is not really in my wheelhouse, nor do I have access to a like-minded spiritual community. Can that be parlayed into something that's relatable or accessible if you are of a Western mindset and you don't know where that would exist? Can your football team be your like-minded spirituality? Is it that much of a surround yourself with good people, or is it a very specific iteration that requires wisdom and knowledge?
Your football team example is a good one. Your football team's your football team. Okay, you train with your football team to play football. Your goal is to win football matches, get fit, etc. If I said to you, go and hang out with belly dancers to get good at football, you're not going to do that, are you? So same. So when we're talking about, like-minded spiritual community, it's the like-minded bit, right? If you don't have them now, you go find them. So before a footballer becomes a footballer, they have to find a football team to train with.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
And sometimes people find themselves creating one. Sometimes I'll meet people who, they're not of any faith, they're not of any religion, they want to cultivate the spiritual side of themselves, and I might introduce them to or tell them about various events. Maybe nothing clicks right now, but what they do is they grab a book they love or something that's been recommended and they read it with some friends and they start studying it together. And the people who are already their well-wishers they're all starting to become like-minded in a different kind of way. It's like starting to play football with your mates. Now, you might stick around and carry on for 10 more years and your other 2 mates drop off. And the same thing can happen. It's like you can either start one yourself with pre-existing friendships or join one as you feel comfortable. This is the thing where you don't already have one. Go try it out. Go meet people. Don't let this whole, we've got into such a bad habit through the COVID lockdown of becoming so habituated to being at home and, listening online and being present online, we are losing that human experience. Get out there. There's lots of people outside waiting to be met and to meet you, you know?
I mean, that's why community is key. One thing I did want to ask you, because I suppose you could look at this from two sides of it. Can your job be your like-minded spiritual community? Only because I ask this because there's different dynamics at play. You know, there's power dynamics, there's financial dynamics. Could that be a healthy spiritual like-minded community?
Anything can be a healthy like-minded spiritual community. It's all about the consciousness of the individuals and the purpose of the individuals in that collective, right? So sometimes people create that, right? So I, like the example that we have at the Royal College of Psychiatrists, we've created a community of these 5,000 psychiatrists who are like-minded in that actually we'd like to look at the spiritual aspects of psychiatry. So in that sense, our work became that. The other side, though, is I think as you become more spiritually evolved yourself, you carry that with you wherever you go. So even when you're not in an environment which is obviously spiritual, you will see things through a spiritual lens, right? It's whatever we do regularly, we tend to see things through that lens. Again, like a footballer will explain things and see things through analogies of football, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, even though for me, a lot of times when I'm teaching, I explain everything through the metaphor of food. Not because it's the easy way to understand it, but it's because I love it personally. It's something it's a passion. It's something, it's a hobby. It's something in many ways, I spend more time looking into that than I do, reading different things that might be helpful for even a podcast conversation like this. But it's also because for me, it gives me that space of a different lens that I can filter my own perspective through, and I think we all need that. Hi friends, I hope you're enjoying listening to the show. One of the ways that we can keep this pod going in the best possible way is by the help of some of our amazing partners and friends. So if you can give me just a few moments to listen into these ads and messages, it would be so appreciated. Exhale is a choice to take control of your mind and mental health. Welcome to the Just Breathe course for breathwork and meditation, our 6-week program to help you breathe better, reduce stress, and regulate the nervous system. Hi, I'm Michael James Wong, meditation and breathwork teacher and founder of Just Breathe. And my life's work is dedicated to helping as many people as possible quiet the mind using the power of breathwork and meditation. And that's why I created Exhale. This course brings together my 20 years of experience studying, sharing, and teaching these practices in the real world. Inside the course, you'll gain instant on-demand access to over 100+ videos, lectures, technique tutorials, and guided breathwork and meditation practices dedicated to helping you create a personal and powerful ability to respond to any and all of life's big and small stressful moments. In this course, you'll learn my unique perspective and agnostic approach to help quiet the mind and regulate the nervous system. Each week during the course, you'll be invited to join our live Zoom sessions where I'll share and discuss with you both the science and the wisdom of these quiet practices. And even more, I'll be joined by some of the world's most well-respected psychologists and neuroscientists to help us understand even further. We'll talk about the nuances of stress, the science of stimulation and how we regulate the nervous system, and how to rewire your brain for the better. And what I love most about this course is you're not just joining me, you're joining a community of like-minded people all around the world who are dedicated to learning more, building their personal practice, and understanding how to use breathwork and meditation to change our lives for the better every single day. As a reminder, you'll get on-demand and lifetime access to the course material. You'll have access to 100+ video lectures, techniques, and practices. And you'll have 6 weeks of live talks and lectures and learnings with me on breathwork and meditation. You'll have 3 amazing talks with some of the world's most well-respected psychologists and neuroscientists. And you'll become part of our global Just Breathe community. So join us on the journey as we take control of our mind and mental health. Welcome to Exhale. The course is now open. See you on the inside. Okay, so we've got practices, we've got positive psychology, we've got like-minded spiritual community.
It's 4th one, sacred architecture.
Right.
It's probably one that people don't talk about that often. So if you look at the architecture of sacred places, it's not just put together because it looks nice. This has been studied, this has been researched. There is something about the geometry, the visuals, the way the spaces are designed. You know, people have heard of Vastu, Feng Shui. Even if you're not using Vastu or Feng Shui, we know that those people who have left us the legacy of spiritual practices and spiritual vehicles and spiritual places, they are designing buildings in a way where that building is fit for the purpose of an external sacred space that helps you to move into your internal sacred space. Now, but it's not just about the architecture itself. The architecture, it also includes the visuals, the sounds that are there, the fragrances that are there. Those are all conducive to your mental health because, I guess, the collective consciousness there, through all of the, our senses that are getting activated, is one that helps you to just become grounded, peaceful, and, have a quiet life, right?
I love that. Well, it's interesting. And just so we're all on the same page, especially if you're just listening to this, when you talk about sacred architecture, you mean human-made buildings for worship.
Yes, that's what's been researched, but also you look at nature. It is sacred by design, right? Because it is designed in such a way that keeps life in harmony. We only see problems when human beings get involved, right, and exploit. But if you look at nature, it is inherently sacred. So one could apply it to nature as well. If you look at the architecture of nature, that's why when we go for that forest walk, right? When we go by the ocean, when we smell a flower, because there's balance there, we feel balanced, right? When something's disrupted even in nature, we start to feel imbalanced because we sense it, because we are actually more connected than we realize. Whether we believe it or not, there's a connection there. So the sacred architecture, that side of it also includes the fact that, space has memory, right? We have memory where we respond to repeated behaviors and repeated patterns, not just our own, but other people's as well. Like, if you look at a place like, I don't know, BBC Broadcasting House, right? It's full of people who are there to create and communicate. Yeah. When I'm in the hospital, people are there to heal and encourage. There's a different type of atmosphere. When I move from the hospital to Broadcasting House, I know when I walk in, a different part of me switches on. Okay, so you look at sacred spaces, the collective consciousness there is for a different purpose. So it's almost like you start to shift into that space. Automatically, your body, mind, and soul starts to move into that space. So sacred spaces, sacred architecture, again, have a very positive impact on our mental health, especially, when we look at mental health, what do people think of? If you say to someone, what does good mental health look like? How would you describe it? People will say that they feel balanced and calm in their feelings. They're not scared of any of their feelings. And actually, somebody who has good mental health is able to feel a wide range of emotions, even the ones that are considered undesirable, but they're appropriate to time, they're appropriate to circumstance, they're readable, they're manageable, right? So this is what I mean by these 5 pillars of mental health. They improve your mental health in that it's not just that they help with supporting recovery when your mental health is poor, but actually they are a good way of keeping your mind just healthy as well as taking care of the soul. And then last but not least, a collaborative relationship with divinity. Okay.
Right.
Now, it sounds very specific, but it's a lot broader than what people think. So first of all, let's look at this idea of divinity. Divinity is that which is bigger than ourselves, okay? That idea of where spirituality brings us together. Now, some people will connect with divinity as a universal force that binds all of us and is there kind of pervasive. Others will connect with divinity as a divinity in our own hearts, right? So there's us, and then there's a divine force independent of us, alongside us. And then there's divinity in the form of God, the person. But the key thing with how whoever is or whatever way you relate to divinity is what's that relationship like? And this keyword collaborative. So what research has found is that where the relationship is fear-based, that can sometimes be quite damaging, right? Because there's almost like a locus of control shifts from me to something or someone else.
Can you give me an example of what do you mean a relationship being fear-based?
Everything that happens to me is either just a punishment or a reward.
Got it.
Okay, so that means it's not really that much to do with me. Somebody else is deciding the outcome all the time, right? And that is quite fear-based because, and some might say, well, hang on, that's helpful because sometimes people won't commit suicide because they're scared it's going to take them to a bad place. But any relationship and this is me speaking kind of on a human level here, not a research level, any relationship is a higher quality when it comes from a position of I comply out of love, not out of fear. Does that make sense? Like, I know there's parents who have kids who listen to them because they're scared. But it's also parents who have kids who listen to them because they love them, right? And the dynamic is very different. It's easier for both the parents and the kids where that dynamic is one of love. So the fear-based relationships with the divinity we find can be quite stressful for people, whether they have mental health problems or not. You generally find people quite stressed by that. And they may even leave their spirituality altogether or their faith altogether if it feels burdensome, because then it breeds guilt and, self-doubt and self-resentment. Then you have the awe and reverence. Whilst awe and reverence is in quality, more helpful than fear, it can be quite impersonal as well. And, it's not one that's been explored as much as the collaborative side. So with awe and reverence, there's a bit more of a shift with this locus of control. Okay, I have some control, but still the majority of the control is with divinity, right? And then there's the collaborative. Okay, actually, I have my free will. Divinity has free will. It's a collaborative relationship. I have my choices, my locus of control. I'm entirely responsible for what comes my way and what doesn't, and what I do with what comes my way. And equally, you're free to respond how you want to respond to me, and I believe you are good and kind and benevolent and loving and have my best interests at heart. Do I choose to see that? How do I choose to see that? So the research shows that those with a collaborative relationship, because it puts the locus of control back in their core, there's an empowered feeling, even in tough times. And that's really good for people's mental health, because when our mental health is coming, when our purpose is coming from, or our choices are coming from a place of fear and avoidance, generally it weakens our psychological resilience. And where our purpose or ability to choose is coming from a place of empowerment, that I have the ability to affect change in my life, whether it's in my body, in my mind, in my spiritual life, universally, it's far more empowering, and it makes the mind much stronger.
I think it's really insightful, because everything you're saying, obviously I very much believe in the same pillars, that understanding of how we use the practices. We have positive psychology, we have like-minded community, we have
sacred
architecture, and then we have
a collaborative relationship with divinity. Yeah,
there's the good memory today. And what's interesting about that is, while we can understand it and hear this conversation and appreciate it, how does then that pull into, for example, like patient work? Are you bringing that or recommending that to people? Say they're coming to you purely not knowing maybe your depth of background with just mental health issues, depression, anxiety, ADHD, whatever it is. Are you literally going straight to these 5 pillars? How does that intersect and weave in?
If you look at these 5 pillars, the research on spirituality and mental health, remember what I said, they're good for your mental health. They're not a treatment. They're not a cure for schizophrenia or depression or anxiety. And I really want to be clear about that, because even in my pastoral work, okay, I will have people who are very serious about their spiritual life who might avoid medical or psychological treatments for quite severe health problems, believing that spirituality is enough to treat those. I know if they had cancer, they wouldn't pray the cancer away. They would go and get radiotherapy, chemotherapy, surgery, whatever they need to get. But because the mind sits so close to the soul, people often get the two mixed up. And I don't mean philosophically. I mean just in day-to-day life, right? You can believe to your core that I'm more than the mind. But until you actually experience you're more than the mind, just having that belief means that usually on a day-to-day level, you just perform and behave based on whatever your mind thinks and feels, right? So they will often just kind of not wanting to feel like a weak person. That's often what I hear is, oh, that means I'm a weak spiritual person, or I'm not very spiritually strong, or if I've got a mental health problem. No, your mind is also connected to your brain. Stuff can go wrong with your brain. Your mind is connected to society. Things can go wrong in relationships. All of these things can go wrong with your hormones, which affect your mental health, you know? So this idea that, so spirituality is good for your mental health in many ways, but it doesn't mean it cures mental illness on its own. We are whole beings. Okay, we are multifaceted whole beings, biological, psychological, social, spiritual. Whenever something is disordered in one modality, you can be sure that there's an impact from the other modalities, probably in terms of causation, but equally, your improvement's going to lie in all. Now, as a medical professional, I will always, doesn't matter whether the person knows my spiritual background or not, right? If they are unwell, my first service is to treat their illness with whatever I have available and whatever they're willing to receive. Even medication I can't force someone to take medication. That is still a dialogue, right? Someone might not even want psychotherapy because not everybody's psychologically minded. Some people just say, I don't talk. I'm not into talking. Can you just give me a pill? Thank you very much. Somebody else might go, no, can I not just pray this away? I'm like, well, actually, in fact, if you improve your mental health, it's good for your spirituality because the mind acts as a bridge between our outward-looking ego, right, our temporary ego, and that more permanent, ego means sense of identity, and that more permanent spiritual sense of who I am. And so actually decluttering the mind, clearing that bridge, is one of the best things we can do for ourselves. So in clinical practice, the first thing is everything's underpinned by how can I be of most service to my client or anybody I'm speaking to. Let me meet you where you're at, not push my own agenda. And actually, it would be contradictory to the Hippocratic Oath to actually try and impose and push something on someone that they're not ready for, whether it's medication, psychological therapies, or a spiritual conversation. However, when patients know that their clinicians, whatever their training is, whatever their background is, are open to a dialogue about all parts of themselves, even if they know nothing about it, it really helps that therapeutic relationship.
And I was going to ask that as a follow-up. I don't know how much patient work you do these days, but with your schedule, because I know you have a lot of different ways in which you share this work, but do you disclose that up front as far as your background, as far as your expertise, or is it not the place of the clinician or expert to disclose and just let people take you at face value?
No. But these days everybody Googles.
True.
Right? Unless you literally have nothing about yourself, people can at least find a picture of you or some, sentence. So I think just because of the work that I do, it's, if anybody Googles me, they'll know that, okay, she's got a special interest in spirituality and mental health. However, if I look at my work simply as a psychiatrist, they know that when they're coming to see me as a psychiatrist, they're getting Dr. Chetna Kang, the psychiatrist. They're not coming to me as a priest or anything like that. That's there's a space for that. But, we are all whole persons. Again, we're bringing all parts of ourselves to anything. And the responsible thing to do is you act within the framework that's giving you the platform to serve people. Does that make sense?
Oh, absolutely. And I really appreciate the way that you approach the conversation, because what's really important for me in our show, in these episodes, is the perspective that we can offer. Never being binary, never being absolutely linear, because everyone approaches things a different way. Especially as well, I get to speak to a lot of amazing people, really interesting people like yourself with, in many ways, lots of different multidisciplinary backgrounds, but in many ways they all end up being of service with whatever means necessary, right? That idea of whatever means necessary is what someone's willing to maybe go on a journey with you, what anyone's willing to maybe understand or help to expand or be educated on, and meeting them where they are, but also knowing that if there's more of interest, then we can go there. And I think what I find really fascinating these days, especially in the world of mental health, there's obviously a lot of clinicians and experts and perspectives or practices, but more and more what I'm seeing, talking to people like yourself, is that there is one way, but there's also other ways.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. It's not a case of it's either this or that. It's that whole binary thing which gets people confused, right? It can only be this or that. It's actually a very immature, childlike way of thinking, the whole black and white thinking. Actually, It's a rainbow, right? There's a whole spectrum, and it's this and this. So again, back to that, it's not science or spirituality, it's science and spirituality. There are things that we work with which are very obvious to us. We don't need to tune in into anything other than our 5 working senses, and we can see it and experience it. And there are many things, even outside of spirituality, that we just accept. right? And we love, we enjoy, we inherently, intuitively know to be good for us without anybody telling us it's wise to do so or even showing us a research paper on it. You see what I mean? It's like, even if I look at a lot of the things that are there in the 5 pillars of spirituality and mental health, there's this little voice in the back of my head whenever I, speak about those pillars. I'm like, why are we trying to prove the things that people actually just know help them? We know being with people who are kind, loving, who are forgiving, grateful is going to make us feel good. Don't we know that? Right? We know that. We know stillness, quiet, having prayerful space where you have dialogue with someone you trust, okay, where you're engaging in connecting with sound vibration that takes you to a place which maybe other conversations don't. We kind of inherently know that that's going to be good for us.
Yeah, I think it's that funny thing where we inherently know that it's good for us, but we're easily distracted and forget.
Mm-hmm.
So in those 5 pillars, my question for you is, which one do people find most challenging?
I don't think people find doing any of them challenging in itself. I think what people find challenging is committing. Because once you commit to doing something regularly, whether it's spiritual or not spiritual, then once that decision has been made, this is what I'm going to do, right? The rest follows very easily. It's getting to that point, am I going to do it or not, that I think people find difficult because we are in an age of distraction, okay? I've got a friend who calls digital media weapons of mass distraction, right? Because the culture of digital media is there's a reason it's called your social media feed. We are literally being fed. We're consuming, we're digesting, and all of those things we're digesting is going somewhere in us, either latent in the subconscious and unconscious, or we're working with it in our conscious mind. And with these 5 pillars, they may be readily available to access. But when somebody has 1,000 different things thrown at them, the one that's thrown at them the most frequently and most intensely is actually usually what people end up acting on. Okay, because our mind is like a sponge. You put a sponge in blue water, it becomes blue. You put it in pink, it becomes pink. So whatever we surround ourselves with is really going to have a big influence on what we desire, because we don't desire anything until we're exposed to it.
Yeah.
Right? The desires don't just come out of the sky. You will never want chocolate if you've never heard of it, smelt it, or been told it's delicious. Right? Nothing. If we haven't heard of it, you just never want it. Sometimes someone will say to you, "Oh, have you heard of this brand?" You'll be like, "Who?"
Yeah.
And they're like, "Why have you haven't?" Do you see what I mean? Because you had no desire for it until you heard of it, right? So what we expose ourselves to ultimately shapes our desires. What shapes, and once our desires start forming, then that really feeds into what we contemplate, what we think about, what we imagine, how we see our future. And then that forms our intention, our will, which then informs our action. So with these 5 pillars, I would say it's not so much that people find those activities difficult inherently. It's more coming to the point of, do I want to invest in any of them in my life? And I think one of the challenges is because there's so many things competing for our interest right now. And because a lot of the things competing for our interest give us a quick win, we tend to invest in the things that give us a quick win. But remember, quick wins only go skin deep. Mm-hmm. And we're deeper than skin deep. So those things which penetrate to the very core of us require us to move away from these things which are quick wins.
Where I've gotten to in our conversation, and me being, let's say, the voice of the listener as well, and trying to kind of make this applicable, actionable. What I love about the pillars is it gives a lot of perspective, it gives context, it gives consideration. If I'm listening to this in my bedroom in the middle of the country and I feel like none of this directly applies to me, spirituality or religion, how do I put this into practice in a way that works for me at a very base, simple, day-to-day action? So could you give me the 5 pillars? Could you walk me through how I could touch each of those pillars or practice each of those pillars if I had no current spiritual connection?
If you don't want a spiritual connection, then there's not a lot I can say to you. Because some people don't. They're just like, no, I'm quite happy where I am. Thank you very much. It's not my bag. And actually, for those people, I would say something that could be helpful is if you don't want to touch on the 5 pillars, just even remembering that you're not your mind, without even having to worry about what else you could be. You're not just your mind. Like a lot of my patients say, one of the most helpful things I tell them is that they're not just their mind. And just recognizing I'm not just my mind, I'm not just my body, allows you to then go, okay, well then that means, hang on, if I'm not that, if I'm not just that, that means I can watch it and choose whether I respond to it. Because my thoughts are my thoughts, they're not who I am, right? Sometimes someone might say, okay, I'm a really bad person because I've been having negative thoughts. You've been having negative thoughts. You are not negative thoughts. Do you see what I mean? Mm-hmm. So if you have them, you can also choose to transform them. You can choose not to engage with them. You can choose to watch them, listen to them, and say, okay, I'm not going to act on you. Thank you very much, right? Same with feelings. So just that simple thing of just recognizing, look, if there's anything you want to take away from this, and you don't want to touch on spirituality, you're not just your mind, and you don't have to be overpowered by your thoughts and feelings. You can choose. You can pick and choose. And if you just practice that, you will start to actually experience some other, even if you call it your brain, some other part of you is going to open up.
So if people are interested and want to reach out, find out more, where's the best place for them to connect with you?
Sure, they can find me on Instagram at Dr. Chetna Kang or on YouTube at Dr. Chetna Kang.